Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. On November 5th, 2024, the US citizens will elect their next president. The election in USA has raised considerable excitement in India as well, and hence IGPP began an educational series to introduce the audience to the various facets of the election procedure. A host of eminent academics have helped us reflect on various issues that are important to American voters and understand the consequences of the voters' choice upon the larger world with particular focus on India, and highlight the role played by Indian and other diaspora communities in the US election. We continue to take a new issue each week, detail its historicity and contemporary problems through a graphic video, and engage with senior scholars who provide valuable insights and new perspectives. Electoral funding plays a pivotal role in modern US elections, serving as the backbone for campaign operations and political messaging. It is used to fuel political campaigns and includes the donations and contributions that candidates, parties, and political groups rely on to run successful campaigns. In a political landscape where visibility and influence are paramount, funding allows campaigns to reach voters through advertising, ground operations, and voter outreach. As a result, electoral funding shapes political influence, as those with greater resources may better promote their message, engage voters, and eventually influence election outcomes. The history of electoral funding in the US dates back to the earliest elections, when money played a somewhat limited role in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Campaigns during this period were smaller and less expensive, often relying on personal networks, grassroots engagement, and the backing of political parties or wealthy individuals for basic costs like transportation and printed materials. However, the power of money began to grow in the late 19th century when corporate funding and large individual donors became more prominent, often shaping political agendas. This period saw the rise of business interests, such as railroad companies, wielding significant influence in politics. In the 20th century, campaign finance became more structured with the rise of political action committees or PACs, enabling organizations to pool funds for candidates and causes. Key regulations like the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 and its 1974 amendments introduced limits on contributions and spending, while the Federal Election Commission was created to enforce these rules. However, huge donations from businesses, unions, and rich individuals continue to play a significant role, particularly through super PACs, which can raise an unlimited amount of money. Although private funding dominates, small donors have gained influence, especially with campaigns like Bernie Sanders and Barack Obama's, where grassroots support and online crowdfunding became significant. The money raised during elections is primarily spent on a variety of campaign activities. Advertising is one of the most significant expenses, spanning television, digital, print, and radio ads, as campaigns aim to reach voters across multiple platforms. Ground operations, including rallies, events, and candidate travel, also require significant funding to maintain a visible presence. Polling and focus groups, essential for refining campaign messages and understanding voter sentiment, require constant financial backing. In addition, campaigns invest heavily in voter outreach and mobilization efforts, using telephonic communication, social media campaigns, and direct voter contact to secure support. Salaries for campaign staff and consultants further add to the financial demands, ensuring that campaigns operate efficiently. The influence of money on politics extends beyond the election cycle. Donors, particularly those who contribute large sums, often shape political agendas and policy priorities. Lobbying, both during and after elections, allow these donors to maintain influence over elected officials, pushing for legislation that aligns with their interest. There are numerous examples where major donors have had significant sway over policy decisions, particularly in areas like tax reform, healthcare, and environmental regulation, underscoring the close relationship between money and political power. The Supreme Court's 2010 decision in Citizens United versus FEC further transformed the landscape by allowing unlimited independent spending by corporations and unions, significantly increasing the role of money in elections. Critics argue that this decision has led to a disproportionate influence of wealthy donors and corporations in politics, drowning out the voice of average voters. The rise of dark money or undisclosed contributions funneled through non-profit organizations has also raised concerns about transparency and the potential for corruption. With money flowing from anonymous sources, it becomes difficult to track who is funding campaigns and what influence they may have over elected officials. Efforts to regulate and reform electoral funding have been ongoing, though progress has been slow. The current campaign finance laws aim to introduce transparency, with requirements for disclosure of donations and spending. However, loopholes and weak enforcement have hindered their effectiveness. The reform advocates call for public financing of campaigns, caps on donation, and stricter disclosure requirements. Programs like matching funds and tax credit for small donors have been proposed to encourage greater public participation in the funding process. Recent legislative efforts, such as the For the People Act, have aimed to address these issues, although passing such reforms remain a challenge in the current political environment. The ongoing debate over money in US politics is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. While electoral funding is necessary for the operation of campaigns, its influence on policy and the potential for corruption continue to raise concerns. While the US election has the world on the edge of its seats, there are certain aspects of the election process that are quite puzzling. For example, the long campaign period, the scale of campaigning, and the money involved. To discuss this very important and unique aspect, that is campaign finance, today we are joined by Professor Robert G. Boatright. Professor Boatright is faculty at Clark University and the Director of Research for National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona. His research focuses on the effects of campaign and election laws on the behavior of politicians and interest groups, with a particular emphasis on primary elections and campaign finance. Professor Boatright is the author and editor of several books, including Reform and Retrenchment, A Century of Efforts to Fix Primary Elections, and The Deregulatory Moment, a comparative perspective on changing campaign finance laws. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you.
So to begin with the basics, in the US election, a presidential candidate announces his candidacy, then runs for primaries with other members of his party that takes place over a period of a few months, and the winner of primaries then finally has a face-off with the presidential nominee of the other party. which again then happens over a course of 3 to 4 months. Each round would require a campaign, and it would mean a lot of funds would be required for TV ads, social media campaigns, and for a country as vast as the US, just moving around the country. How are campaigns sustained for such a long period of time?
Well, there are three basic mechanisms for this. Candidates can raise their own money. Contributions to candidates are limited by law. This, as of right now, the limit on what any individual can give to a candidate is $3,300, and a group is limited to giving $5,000. So a candidate can raise money in those limited amounts. Generally, to sustain a primary campaign or even a general election campaign, candidates have to start raising money quite early. It's not uncommon in the case of a presidential election for candidates to declare for office 2 years in advance or even 4 years in advance. Donald Trump, when he ran for his reelection in 2020, actually had declared his candidacy almost immediately after winning in 2016. So it takes a long time to raise money for a campaign like that. The second way to raise money is there are independent groups known as super PACs, which are able to, these are separate from the candidate. That is, a candidate cannot communicate with these groups, and they are formally not part of that candidate's campaign. Such groups can raise unlimited amounts of money from individuals, corporations, or other organizations, again, as long as they are not explicitly coordinating with the candidate. From a candidate's point of view, the virtue of a group like that is that such a group can raise a lot of money very, very quickly. So, a very wealthy individual could give millions of dollars to such a group, all in one shot. So those sorts of groups can work to help elect candidates, but again, they're not part of the candidate's campaign. And third, political parties can raise and spend money to help candidates. However, a political party organization is not going to do that in a primary. That is only for the general election. In circumstances where there's not likely to be a competitive primary, as was perhaps the case for Republicans in 2020 and 2024, spending by the party during the primary season, it clearly only advantages one person, so it can be done earlier. But in the case of, say, you can think about the 2020 election for Democrats, the Democratic Party was not going to spend money on behalf of any candidate before it became clear who the nominee was going to be, although parties can spend money during that period attacking the other party. So in 2020, the Democratic Party could spend money attacking Donald Trump during the 2019, early 2020, but they did not begin spending money on behalf of Joe Biden before it became clear that Biden was in fact going to be the nominee.
When a candidate drops out of the race, be it at the primary level or drops out of the race completely, it is often assumed that the candidate ran out of money to sustain the campaign. Is it to imply that the candidate's fund generating capacity takes precedence over their popularity with the voters and their policy stances?
Well, I wouldn't think about it exactly that way. We're talking just about presidential campaigns here. I can talk later if you want about campaigns at other levels of office. But for the most part, the money that a candidate raises for his or her own campaign fund is really a sign of how that candidate is doing. Nobody's going to contribute money to a candidate who appears unlikely to win. But often it is the case that a candidate will show that they're not that likely to win before their money has run out. So in the case of 2024, for instance, I don't have the numbers right on hand, but I don't know that you could look and say Nikki Haley dropped out of the Republican primary because she ran out of money. I think you might look and say contributions to Nikki Haley started to decline as it became evident that she was not likely to win. So the two things sort of go hand in hand. But in terms of, again, of candidate funds, it's not necessarily the same thing. If you go back to 2020, where there were, 1.20 Democratic candidates, that campaign was over with so suddenly, so early in the primary season, that many of the people running against Joe Biden had not, in fact, exhausted their campaign funds. Now, again, there are other sort of buckets, you might say, for campaign funding. So independent groups, again, these what are called super PACs, these organizations can, again, they can be flush with money and just decide, well, we're not going to spend on behalf of this candidate, or such a group could raise money very, very quickly on behalf of a candidate. So from time to time, we do see candidates who clearly have no chance of winning, but there is still an outside organization that has its own reasons for wanting to continue to spend on their behalf. This was a problem for Republicans back in 2012, long after it became clear that Mitt Romney was going to be the Republican nominee. Other candidates of the party, Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum, for instance, they kept going. They didn't have money of their own, but there were super PACs that were very unhappy that Romney was the nominee and were willing to keep spending money, even though they didn't really have much of a strategic reason for doing so.
On that point, are the ways and means of financing campaign at different levels of government? For example, presidential race versus a race for the Senate or for a city mayor?
Well, that's a complicated question. In other races for federal office, so for the United States Senate, for the House of Representatives, obviously much less money is spent on behalf of candidates. You can still think about the campaign in terms of these three sources. That is, candidates can raise money for their own campaign from individuals and groups subject to limits. Their party can spend money on their behalf, but will only do so in a general election or an uncontested primary. And outside organizations can spend, again, as long as they are unconnected to the candidate. Now, with that said, most races for the House of Representatives are uncompetitive. That doesn't mean that those candidates don't raise money, in part because you can't predict a few years out whether you're going to have a competitive race, and because there are a lot of donors who will give to a candidate even if they're unlikely to have opposition. So interest groups, for instance, let's say that you're an interest group that represents home builders or, what's another good example? Automobile dealers, organizations like this are not particularly partisan. They don't necessarily just support Democrats or support Republicans. So they may have an interest in giving to sitting members of Congress. There's no quid pro quo necessarily, but they might think, well, if we give money to everybody who's there, we'll have a good relationship with them. We'll go to their fundraising events. So many members of Congress in completely uncompetitive races still manage to raise large sums of money, but their party is not necessarily going to spend money on their behalf because they don't need it. Outside groups are not going to spend money advocating for them, again, because they don't need it. So what often results is that a small number of campaigns are extremely competitive and others are just not. And there's money raised, but it's not necessary. So to put this in context, I live in Massachusetts, which is a state that is heavily Democratic. My Senator Elizabeth Warren is up for re-election this year. She raises a substantial amount of money, in part because she has a sort of dedicated set of followers who are willing to give her money, but she doesn't need it necessarily. She's unlikely to face a serious opponent this year. So she can turn around and give some of that money to other candidates, give that money to the party, spend it however she sees fit. But ultimately, she's unlikely to spend much money at all in Massachusetts this year. In contrast, some states do have highly competitive races. Among the most competitive Senate races this year is a race in Montana. The state of Montana is geographically large, but it is, in terms of population, it's quite small. It's I believe less than 2 million people, so less than a fifth the size of Massachusetts. But probably by the end of this campaign, the two candidates and groups supporting them will have probably spent somewhere in the neighborhood of probably over $100 million, which will be, my guess would be that'll be 10, 20, 30 times what's spent in Massachusetts. So that's the federal thing. You asked about mayors and candidates at other levels of office. So campaigns at the federal level, President, Senate, House of Representatives, all have the same basic logic. There is a cap that is inflation adjusted for contributions to candidates. States are allowed to set their own limits for how much one can give to a candidate, and states are permitted to establish various types of public financing. Not many of them do, but there are some states that have explored offering various schemes for public financing. Usually what it involves is if a candidate raises a threshold number of small contributions, say you raise 100 contributions of $5 or something like that, then the state will give you a lump sum to campaign or will match your contribution. So states are permitted to do that. States are not permitted to do away entirely with individual contributions. That's a right that the Supreme Court says individuals have to give money to candidates. But so states can do things somewhat differently, and many do. The same thing goes for city elections, mayors, and so on. Most American cities have nonpartisan elections, so parties are not necessarily involved, but still candidates can raise money at the state level subject to limits set by their state. So again, my home state of Massachusetts, the limit for what one can raise running at the state level or the municipal level is $1,000 per election cycle, as opposed to the $3,300 at the federal level. So states can do things like that. So generally there's less money spent at the state level, but again, you see the same basic logic that many candidates don't have meaningful opposition, and if they do raise money, they just wind up sending it somewhere else. And then in some instances, you'll see very, very expensive races. So in a state where the state legislature is almost evenly balanced between parties, sometimes you'll see individual races that have a lot of money spent.
In the example that you mentioned of your home state, where Elizabeth Warren is would be running, but there's not a strong opposition to her, and the funds that she may raise, she may utilize it in another manner or to other campaigns. And that brings me to the question, also in light of the recent controversy, the trial of former President Trump, where he used his campaign fund for some other purposes. So are there, limits or laws to ways in which candidates can utilize the campaign money they raise for other campaigns or for other purposes?
Yeah, let me put the issue of Trump aside for a moment, because that's a somewhat different circumstance. But yes, if you've raised money for your campaign, you cannot personally pocket the money. At one time that was possible, but it's been many, many years since that was permissible. So in Warren's case, should Warren step down, she cannot take that money and put it in her pocket. She can use that money to contribute to other candidates, again, subject to limits on what she can give. And she can give an unlimited amount of that money to the Democratic Party. And that's actually an important point to stop and think about, because what that means is that many of the candidates who are most able to raise money, perhaps most charismatic or most well-known, if you think about Democrats, for instance, candidates such as not only Warren, but someone like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, other candidates who are widely known, these folks don't have any reason to spend money for their own campaigns. Again, they don't need it. Sanders will win Senate races in Vermont as long as he chooses to remain there. So that gives them a certain amount of power that they can turn around and support like-minded candidates. In the case of somebody like Ocasio-Cortez, there will also be pressure from the Democratic Party to say, look, you're good at raising money, you don't need it, but our party needs to raise money in order to win a majority in Congress. So parties will often set expectations. They will say to all of their members, it's not as formal as dues, right? But it's the same principle. Parties will say to their members, if you don't need money for your own campaign, we would like you to contribute, X amount, right? $500,000 or something like that to the party campaign organization, which can then spend that money on behalf of candidates who need it. So those candidates could certainly say no, but they generally say yes. And that is one way in which American parties, which are in a lot of ways very weak organizationally compared to other countries of the world, that parties can actually put together sort of a uniform party effort to gain control of the legislature. So that in that way, they can begin to approach the level of, say, European parties, where like the party can spend money as it sees fit or can develop its own campaign message. So in the case of Trump, Trump certainly, I guess, the charitable way to say this is push the boundaries of the law in terms of how his money was spent. I don't know that it has been proven that he personally enriched himself with his campaign money, but he did do things like he has spent campaign money on legal bills. The super PAC that is advocated for him, which again is technically separate from the Trump campaign, has also spent money on his very sizable legal defense fund over the past couple of years. It's unclear whether that is legal or not, but one problem in the US is that the body that enforces campaign finance laws, the Federal Election Commission, has a very difficult time policing violations of campaign finance law. The Federal Election Commission is composed of 6 people, 3 of whom are chosen by Democrats, 3 of whom are chosen by Republicans. And what that means is that, for the most part, popular national candidates, their own party's commissioners, are not necessarily going to rule against them. So a 3-3 deadlock would be no finding. And in addition, there are other problems that the FEC has. It moves very slowly. It often seats on the commission go vacant for long periods of time. Neither party really wants to police its own violations. So when the FEC does find that somebody has violated campaign finance law, has converted that money to personal use or something like that, often they will find this a couple of years or so after the election has happened, which makes that punishment somewhat meaningless, right? If Trump were forced, Trump is perhaps a bad example, but let's say a member of Congress were forced to give back, I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars to their campaign fund long after they had been elected, it would not be hard to do, right? And it wouldn't affect the outcome of the election. It wouldn't affect the spending of that. So it is difficult to police campaign spending at the moment that it's happened. So again, most candidates do not push the boundaries of the law as Trump has. In many circumstances, the law eventually catches up to them. In some circumstances, candidates who violate the law are subject to penalties not from the FEC, but from the Department of Justice, because they have, for instance, engaged in corruption or done something that is, a criminal violation above and beyond campaign finance laws. But these things often take long enough that there's nobody who can step in and prevent candidates from misusing funds at a moment when it is politically relevant.
You also mentioned that candidates can finance their own campaigns, right?
Yes.
And just a hypothetical situation, if rich people decided that they would, run for offices and finance their own campaigns, can't they sort of just monopolize power, or have there been already instances of that happening?
Um, that is, you're right. That's something that I didn't address, and that's an important concern. Um, the rationale for limits on what individuals can give to campaigns other than their own is that we would not want anybody to be able to corrupt a candidate. So the reason, again, to restate, the limit on what I can give to somebody else's campaign is currently $3,300 per election cycle. This is inflation adjusted, so it goes up a little bit every year. And the logic there is that if a campaign costs, I don't know, $1 million, my $3,000 contribution is just not large enough for it to be corrupting, that I can't necessarily go to a candidate and ask for a favor based on that size of a contribution. And if a candidate objected to me, right, or to my political views, it certainly would not harm that candidate to say, no, thanks, we're not going to take a contribution from this person. Now, the challenge in thinking about people funding their own campaigns is that if limits are set based on the possibility that I could corrupt you by giving you money, it's not clear that I would corrupt myself by giving myself a large sum of money were I running for office. So this is what the Supreme Court has consistently stated since the 1970s, that the only basis for limits on campaign finance and contributions is corruption. And so individuals are exempt from this, that according to the court, it's a matter of free speech. If I am able to spend millions of dollars of my own money encouraging people to, I don't know, adopt homeless pets or stop smoking, whatever, right? That's just speech. And nobody would say you can't spend as much of your money as you want. So from the court's perspective, spending that money on behalf of your campaign is similar. Now, does this cause problems? Well, yes. For one thing, people who are able to contribute this sort of money to their campaigns are different from the rest of us. So it's in the interest of political parties to recruit very, very wealthy people to run because they already have money, right? They don't need to raise money. They will not need money that could be redirected to other candidates. So particularly in races for the House of Representatives or the Senate, it can be very attractive to the parties to find wealthy people who will run. The funny thing is these candidates often don't do all that well. So one way to think about campaign finance is if I have to go out there and raise contributions from hundreds or thousands of people, I probably have gotten in touch with my voters, right? I've gone around and I've held fundraising events. And if I'm able to do that, it shows that I am pretty good at campaigning and that I say the right things and so on. So there's an argument to be made that somebody who can raise $1 million in very small contributions is probably a good politician, right? They're good at convincing people to give them money. And somebody who can put a large sum of their own money into a campaign may simply be not a very good politician. So the funny thing about it is that there is a lot of research suggesting that people who contribute their own money to their campaigns simply don't do all that well, and that therefore it's not perhaps as much of a problem as you might think. And finally, to get to the presidential level, it's important to note that we have yet to have a successful candidate who has funded his or her own campaign. We've had some very wealthy people who've run. They've not done well. Former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, the philanthropist Tom Steyer, both of those guys spent huge amounts of money running for president in 2020, but they didn't do all that well. one might say as an example of what I'm saying, right? That they were not as good as candidates as somebody like a Biden or a Sanders who has to go out and ask people for money. And finally, Donald Trump is a very wealthy man, but it's not clear that he spent any of his own money in his campaign. He talked about it. He talked about not needing money from anybody else, but ultimately his campaign was fueled mostly by small contributions, not by his own money. So whatever one thinks about Trump, whatever one thinks about the perils of wealthy people being in office, he's not president because he spent his own money running, or was not president.
Have there been direct correlation between the amount of money that has been raised by, for example, super PACs and then, contributed to campaigns, not directly, and some of the policy decisions that the candidates might have taken once they were in office? So sort of like a quid pro quo. And have there been such controversies, and what was the public's reaction to it?
Well, there are always controversies about this, in part because it probably does happen sometimes, and in part because it is a good tactic by one's opposition to point to large money spent on your behalf and say, look, see what happens. In terms of consequences, it's tricky to measure. One I guess a few things that are relevant here. One of them is that super PAC money, again, is technically independent of a candidate. A candidate is not supposed to know what a super PAC is doing. A candidate is not supposed to communicate with a super PAC. And so that means it is somewhat more complicated than any sort of direct quid pro quo might be, right? The groups such as this are not giving money to a candidate. In many circumstances, super PAC spending, because it is independent of candidates, such groups are able to spend money talking about things that candidates may not care about. So for instance, let me think of a good example. I might be, say a wealthy billionaire who wants to spend money encouraging people to, talking about cryptocurrencies, right? Or maybe I've picked out candidates who I think will be on my side in terms of regulating cryptocurrencies or something like that. That doesn't mean that that's part of that candidate's agenda, right? That would mean that I, as a wealthy person, want to make it part of that candidate's agenda or want to inject that story into the campaign. So it's not necessary. So again, the people spending this are not supposed to talk to candidates about what they're doing. So there is legally a barrier between those two things, and it means that it's hard to measure whether candidates are doing things on behalf of such groups. So that's one point. Another point might be that oftentimes those who spend large amounts of money, they've chosen candidates who they think are already good on their issue. So one of the more controversial things in primary elections so far this year is that super PACs, somewhat sympathetic to the current Israeli government, have spent a lot of money in a couple different congressional races against candidates who they did not like and, in favor of their opponents. That doesn't mean that there's a quid pro quo, right? It means that they spent money to help people who already were on their side on an issue that, it's not necessarily corruption for somebody to have, different views one way or the other on Israel. So it's difficult to sort of pull out a story about corruption from these sorts of things. Again, it certainly, I think, is the case that if I were running a campaign and I looked and I said, wow, this wealthy individual spent money on behalf of my campaign, that's wonderful. But it is difficult to prove. And then a final point to make: the largest and most influential of these outside groups are not necessarily issue-based groups. So both political parties maintain, again, well, they don't technically maintain it because it's illegal, but it is widely known that there is an organization that will spend money on behalf of Democratic candidates for the Senate. So if you have already given everything you can legally to those Senate candidates, and to the party committees, but you still want to spend more, there's a place for you to put that money, right? But giving money to help Democrats, right, is sort of a broader goal. And the group that does that will again be pooling money from a lot of people. So it's difficult to point to that and say it is corrupted.
What is then wrong with the system if
What-
there are less instances of corruption that have become public? Then how is it that in one of your works you have explored that despite efforts at regulation, interest groups continue to influence election? How are they able to do so if there are several legal barriers and candidates cannot really know what super PACs are helping them? Where is the problem?
Where is the problem? Well, I mean, an easy answer is that none of this is good, right? The sheer amount of money spent on American elections and the fact that there are these unregulated sources of money, I think in many ways is deeply problematic. Were campaign spending limited to individual donations to politicians' campaign funds, right? This first instance that I've spoken about. I think that in such circumstances, these contributions would be a reliable barometer of support for candidates. Now, there would still be problems there. I think it's a problem in any democracy when a candidate has to spend a huge amount of his or her time raising money as opposed to legislating and speaking with the kinds of people who can't contribute money and so on. But at the very least, a system that was entirely dependent only on contributions from, let's say, these first two, from individuals to the campaigns and perhaps on spending by the parties, which are again regulated, then money in many ways would be a barometer of public support, right? The people who raised the most money raised it from the most people, and that's a sign that they have campaigned to people and that their views are popular among a certain number of people. The problem with outside spending, the problem with super PACs, is that campaigns become unpredictable. It is not predictable if I am running for office whether a wealthy organization or individual might all of a sudden decide to put millions of dollars into attacking me for a particular sort of a vote I have taken or for something, right? So it means that there's pressure on candidates to raise as much money as possible, just in case somebody out there decides that they don't like them and they want to spend money against them. So this has caused many problems. It causes politicians to be very averse to doing anything that might antagonize those who would fund efforts like that. It means that the threat to spend money, even if you don't actually do it, can have a substantial impact on public policy. This is an argument I've made about the circumstances of the Republican Party right now in Congress, that there are many Republicans who have a range of views, but are afraid that some outside group might spend money against them if they break with the party on this or that. So in many circumstances, the threat of unregulated spending is a bigger problem than perhaps the reality. So those are a few problems. Now, I mean, I have to confess, I don't know much about how Indian elections operate, but most other democracies in the world also have a substantial public funding component. And there are pros and cons to public financing as well. But again, one of the virtues of a system that involves some public money is, again, it means that candidates don't have to spend all of their time raising money, or that candidates in a system like what I've talked about in some American states, candidates can spend a little bit of time just demonstrating, I'm the kind of person who some people will give a little bit of money to. And then after that, they don't have to worry about that. So public funding has its own problems. In many cases, it can insulate politicians from voters, but it can also compel politicians to actually do their jobs instead of raising money.
What are some of the system has been in place for long of the campaign finance? So there must be some positives to it, right?
Are there any?
Well, right now the system is, I think it's fair to say the system is broken, and it's broken in large part because of the U.S. Supreme Court's reluctance to put any limits on what can be spent in campaigns. So the court decision that legitimized all of these unregulated outside groups that I'm speaking of was called the Citizens United decision, was handed down in 2010. So let me just give you a brief summary of 3 eras of campaign finance and their problems and which of these work better. During the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, entities like super PACs did not exist. There were strict limits on what groups could spend there weren't limits on what groups could spend independently of candidates, but there were limits on what they could talk about. So I could not, for instance, form a group whose sole purpose was to talk about you and how great you are, right? That was just not permissible. I could not run advertisements telling people to vote for you or anything like that. I could not cross that line. And what that meant during that era was that groups could spend money talking about issues. If I wanted to spend money talking about climate change or something like that, I could do that, right? But that was different than spending money telling people vote for this candidate because she will be particularly good on climate change or something like that. So during that era, groups were involved, as I think they should be, but there were limits on their speech. During that era as well, there were no effective limits on what people could give to parties. So during much of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, by the late 1990s, the discussion about problems in our system was focused on whether there were large unregulated contributions going to the political parties. In 2002, a law was passed called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act that did away with these contributions to parties. So from 2002 till about 2010, contributions to parties were strictly limited, contributions to individuals were strictly limited, and the activities of groups were strictly limited. And this era was, for some people, was an improvement over the prior era because it did away with these big contributions to parties. But it is debatable whether that was a good idea. That is, perhaps it is good for parties to be able to raise large sums of money because parties have a brand, parties have an agenda, parties can make choices about where money goes more effectively than individual candidates. So in hindsight, one of the virtues of this earlier system might have been that the Democratic Party could move money around the country to elections that would enable it to hopefully win a majority in Congress, and the Republicans could do the same sort of thing. So the potential for corruption, for large donations was there, but there was also some flexibility for the parties. So in 2010, with the Supreme Court Citizens United decision, they kept in place these limits on parties, but struck down rules on what groups could do. So if you put all of this together, we went from an era where parties were much stronger, but were also a potential source for corruption, to an era from 2002 to 2010 where there were limits on spending in all of these categories, to a period since 2010 where the strength has really gone to groups. So I don't know which is better, I don't know which of those first 2 models is better, but I think it's becoming apparent to us that giving outside groups, more power than political parties has created real problems in our system. So in terms of what's better, I think a system that gave parties a more meaningful role than they have, which doesn't necessarily mean unlimited contributions, but larger contributions perhaps, a system that was able to provide some measure of public funding to candidates might be good. So in some ways, there's a problem with our court. In some ways, it's a problem with our government that politicians are not good at creating public funding systems that are equitable. It's a problem, again, in most countries that have public financing, that if you ask the people in office to develop a public financing system, often they will develop one that keeps them there and disadvantages those who might wish to run.
Recently, at the Democratic National Convention, Senator Bernie Sanders said that we need to get big money out of the political processes. Do you think that that sentiment echoes with the public or the political class? And have there been efforts, or is there a push to reform the current campaign finance system as it is?
Well, so Sanders, certainly Sanders's argument resonates with many people. It is not, although Sanders has staked out a position sort of on the left of the Democratic Party, it's not necessarily a view that is only part of the left, right? Donald Trump said similar sorts of things, right? Part of Trump's story when he ran in 2016 was, I'm a wealthy guy and I've seen all the corruption that rich people do. And I mean, initially, again, he said he was going to spend his own money, right? And he was like, that's how I'll fail to be corrupted. So it is a sentiment that resonates with a lot of people. In terms of whether it's feasible, it means many different things. There are many ways that corporations and wealthy individuals can spend money outside of the political process, right? If you are in government, the kinds of people who are able to spend money lobbying you, sending their people to Washington, writing draft legislation, hosting like nice parties in Washington, that's big money right there, right? And that's in many ways totally separate from the campaign finance system. So Sanders' agenda that is bigger than just elections. I think that one thing to think about, while I guess I'm broadly sympathetic to Sanders' argument about putting greater limits on campaign spending. One thing to think about there is that we do have a lot of research that shows that small donors, the kinds of people who give, say, $20 or $50 or even a couple $100 to a candidate, those people are not necessarily representative of the American population. So Sanders does very well among individuals like that, but people who give small sums of money are often highly ideological. And so they tend to be, if you think about, a sort of a left-right political spectrum in America, they tend to disproportionately be from the left and the right, not necessarily the political center. So Sanders's idea would in some ways encourage the sorts of people who contribute to highly polarizing candidates. Among people that Sanders probably does not care for instance, the most successful candidate at raising small contributions in the US Congress is Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia, who's kind of said a number of provocative or incendiary things. There are a lot of people out there in America who are willing to give her $50. There are not a whole lot of, boring business organizations that want to spend thousands of dollars advocating for somebody like that. So I think in many ways, Sanders' solutions would make Congress more representative of the people, and there are many good things to be said there, but at the same time, there is the risk that the kinds of people that he would encourage as campaign donors might further polarize the system.
Thank you so much for joining us, sir. It was a very insightful and very enlightening discussion, and I know now so much more about US campaign finance.